I'm Joe Duffy, Grandmaster Sports Handicapper and CEO of OffshoreInsiders.com. Now, 60 Minutes is doing a feature on Billy Waters of the Computer Boys, and a few of you have asked me really how he's influenced my handicapping over the years, and I want to talk about that. Most specifically, when I first heard about Billy Waters, when I entered this industry back in the 1980s, I knew that he was an expert on computers. And in order to duplicate that success, I said, I'm going to have to learn a little bit about computers, how it applies to sports handicapping. Now, I did have some computer classes back in school during my days at California University of Pennsylvania. But of course, what I learned back then is pretty much outdated. But it did help me use one of the first quality programs out there that were available to the general public. It was a program called the Point Spread Analyzer. It was written by Dr. Mike Orkin, who is a PhD, a professor of statistics out in one of the California universities, California Northridge, I believe it was. And that program was focused a little bit more on systems and angles. And essentially, there's three types of computer programs that I use as part of my sports handicapping. One is just like that, a systems and angles type program. An example would be one that we've been using since our score phone days in the 1980s. It's leveled off a little bit, but it's still held up over all these years when we go with more than a 5-point road favorite in the NBA off a loss as a road underdog. That's just an example of a type of system. You could say, a double-digit favorite in whatever sport off of a double-digit loss. But that is an example of a systems type program. Then you have the simulator programs, and those that do the actual predictions of the outcome of a game. Team rankings, AccuScore would be examples. And I'm even going to give a shout out to a competitor of mine, Jim Feist. He has what he calls his Feist cover percentage factor, and that's actually a pretty good program. We use that. And the third would be power rankings. Now, power rankings, we quite frankly weigh the least. Massey power rankings are our absolute favorite, and more specifically in pro and college football, Massey combines all the other power rankings out there, such as the Sagarins, which is probably the most well-known, the Dunkel rankings, which have been around forever and a day, and he combines all of them and has a system where he weighs them all equally, and each kind of overrides the weakness of the other, and that comes up with a pretty good power ranking for college and professional football. The reason, though, that we weight it third most is, to tell you the truth, those power rankings aren't necessarily aimed specifically at the gambler always, and it puts a little bit too much emphasis in wins and losses. And the square player doesn't realize that wins and losses are a little bit overrated when it comes to picking games against the spread. We're worried about margin, not simple straight up wins and losses. But where do those, how do we weigh those? When it comes to the systems, which is what we like the most, we only consider something right around 80 units to be statistically significant. Now, it's not like it's a clear cutoff point. In other words, if something is at 78, or is at 78 units, we consider it not statistically significant, and if it's at 80.5, we do consider it statistically significant. Not like that, but right around 80 is what we do consider to be something that we want to weigh pretty heavily. Obviously, the higher the total net units won, the more heavily we weigh it. Or conversely, if we have something with a small sample size, we will use the Z-score. Now, Z-score, there are various calculators right on the internet, but it is a mathematical formula that statisticians have been using for years and years to measure the reliability of data. So it's one or the other. And by the way, when we talk about units, we are talking about 1 unit per bet minus the juice. And they are the most effective. I see too often with wannabe handicappers. They think they've got a great system based on an 8 and 2. They figure it's 80%. Must be fantastic. Anybody that knows even the basics, the absolute first day of Statistics 101 will tell you an 8 and 2 stat is nothing that's of any significance at all. So that's one of the more important things. And most effectively, we use not a specific computer system, but how we use numbers, somewhat inspired also by Billy Waters and the computer group, our performance gap analysis. This is something that we've been working on and fine-tuning over the years. This is specifically, though, in football. We don't have it in other sports, but we're looking for some ways to be as accurate in other sports based on this. But it basically says yards per rush, yards per pass, and yards per play Our lead indicators were things like turnovers and yards per point, are lag indicators. You can search that on our site, joeduffy.net or offshoreinsiders.com, where we explain it more in depth. But just some of the examples of where we have been inspired by the computer group and now Billy Waters in our handicapping. Of course, it's all weighed with a bunch of other factors such as intangibles, matchups, spot plays. One of our upcoming videos is going to be about spot plays, which quite frankly we've really weighted a lot more heavily in recent years than I did my first couple decades of handicapping. We're always refining, always adjusting our techniques. But the short answer to the question is where Billy Waters has most influenced me is how to effectively use computer programming, both when you're talking about angles and systems and when you're talking about the simulator / the prediction software. And then last and least would be the power rankings out there. But all that goes towards our handicapping at offshoreinsiders.com, where I, Joe Duffy, Grandmaster Handicapper, am part of the dream team at God's Tips. God's Tips is the anchor of offshoreinsiders.com.